Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. And for those of you who may not have been with us some of the first or second sessions, just a couple of minutes to tell you where I'm coming from. I started on this effort of trying to reconcile religion and science based on my personal background. I grew up in a very fundamentalist religion environment. Then when I went to college, I was in the hard sciences, electrical engineering, physics, and math, and I was having problems with this statement that science is one thing, religion is another. I just didn't buy that. So in philosophy class, I ran across St. Augustine's writings where he had said, for instance, that God has given us two books to read. One is the inspired scripture, the other is the universe for us to observe and draw conclusions. We spent a good bit of time in the first couple of sessions on really being pretty well governed by St. Augustine's philosophy. We spent a good bit of time on looking at how maybe the scriptures have been interpreted versus what particular quantum physics was saying. As St. Augustine said, the problem if we saw different answers was in our faulty interpretation, not in God's inspired scriptures or in science. This is my comment, not his, but that change of interpretation, as St. Augustine said, would require study on our part. My point would be that Jesus came to take away our sins, not our brains. So we have to an obligation to try to study to see each of those interpretations. We spent a good deal of time on session 1 and 2 looking at the end, similarities between, particularly again, quantum physics, what is being learned in quantum physics, and what the Bible says. We looked at the 6 phases of creation and saw that they pretty well agree when you interpret them in terms of a physics interpretation compared with Genesis. We also saw that in the Bible you can find specific references to both Einstein's special theory of relativity and his general theory of relativity. Again, these were written 4,000 years before Einstein. We saw also the example in the text of the Bible references to what quantum physics calls quantum entanglement or teleportation, the fact that any object can be in more than one place at any one time. We then saw, stated in the Bible, the concept of God's wind blowing on the universe, if you will, and having an immediate, very quick, very large expansion. In science, this is known as the inflationary period, which happened a few microseconds after the Big Bang. We also saw the reference to God creating darkness and that it was a form of energy. This, to me, is the same as what science, quantum physics, has discovered, I believe it's around 1992, in terms of dark energy. The Bible says that form of energy constitutes the essence of the universe. Or what scientists now say is that dark energy constitutes 74 to 75% of the universe. What we see, baronic matter, if you will, or what we can see, constitutes only 4% of the universe. Dark energy is 74, 75%, and dark matter is the other roughly 5 or 6%. We then spent last time looking at really what I termed the DNA of the universe, and that was constituted by 6 natural laws of the universe, which we went over slightly, and 4 natural forces. Tonight, we're going to spend a good deal of time on all of those. Now, my approach to these particular 6 parameters of the universe is rather simple. If you want a very detailed scientific and mathematical discussion of them, I would reference a book that's included at the end on the reference sources, a book called Just 6 Numbers. That's an extremely detailed scientific explanation of these 6 natural laws. Because of one of my backgrounds when I, 100 years ago or more, taught statistics and probability at the university, what I've chosen to do is to say, let's take those 6 laws, not spend a lot of time on the mathematical statements of them and how they're constructed and how do you calculate the results. But I just said, let's take a simple statement of each of those 6 laws, one that any of us can understand, and then try to find the probability or the likelihood that this condition would occur by chance or by creation, if you will. The probabilities that I associate with each of these 6 parameters are not my calculations. On each of the slides, I have tried to indicate where I got the numbers. I did not, my simpleton brain was not capable of calculating those, so I've given the reference to some very bright people, astrophysicists, who have spent their life studying these specific things. So we're going to spend some time on that. And then we'll talk about the conclusion. So with that, let's see if we can go. One of the first things I want to talk about is if you had the pleasure or the torture of having to take a course called thermodynamics in college, which is probably the most boring topic you'll ever see. There's a second law of thermodynamics in there that I just want to point out, that God not only outwitted, obviously, but he won in terms of violating, and it's the only case of violation of the second law of thermodynamics I've ever seen. Because in Genesis it talks about the evening and the morning is the way it was translated, but the original Hebrew are the 2 words erev, meaning evening, and boker has been translated morning, but the true Hebrew translation is disorder for erev and boker for order. The second law of thermodynamics says everything moves from order to disorder. The statement in Genesis by evening and morning, or erev and boker, is it moves from disorder to order. So that creation is seen as 6 phases, if you will, of going from disorder to order of the universe. Little point I made there at the bottom of the slide, life won by outwitting the second law, not by defeating it. And I'm sure all of you want to know what are the 3 laws of thermodynamics, so be sure and write all this down. But my point is that first law is conservation of momentum, which in my simple terms says you can't win. Second law is increasing entropy, which simple language says you can't even break even. The third law, which is non-zero entropy, says you can't get out of the game. Scripture shows exactly opposite of all of those. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, thanks. They're trying to make an educated person out of me here. You've got a hard job. One of the things I want to talk about is if you really want to see a true miracle, look at a drop of water. Water is a molecule formed by 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. The hydrogen was formed a few seconds after Big Bang in the lighter elements. The oxygen was formed several 100 million years after Big Bang, which the elements having to be, the heavier element, oxygen, having to be formed from an exploding star, so millions of years. Each drop of water contains about 1,000 billion molecules of H2O. All life that we know is based on water. Another part of that miracle is water is the only molecule that's lighter in its solid form than it is in its liquid form. It's the only element that we know of, and scientists still don't know why. If it were not, the oceans would freeze from the bottom, and then Earth would be covered with solid ice. Another topic that deals with the laws of time. When we look into space, we're looking into the past. The further into space we look, the further into the past we're looking. For instance, it takes about approximately 8 minutes for light from the sun to reach the earth. So you will never see the sun as it is. You will see it as it was approximately 8 minutes ago. Distances into deeper space aren't measured by miles. The distance is measured in light years. Now, light year, again, is not a measure of time. It's a measure of distance. It's the distance that light would travel in 1 year, traveling at 186,000 miles a second. That means a light year in distance is a little over 6 trillion miles. Here's just the calculation. Someone had asked before about my calculation of it takes about 8 minutes for the light to reach from the sun. The sun is an average of 93 million miles away. That's average because the orbit around the sun is an ellipse, not a circle. They are roughly, light is traveling from the sun at 186,000 miles a second. So if you divide the distance by the rate, you get the time of 500 seconds converted to minutes is 8.33 minutes. So whoopee-doo. Here's a picture that came out, Bob, I think it's somewhere between 82 and 84 because it's when we were having a meeting at our house there with the village church. This is a picture that was taken by the Hubble telescope. It's a star being formed at 14 billion light years away. That's 84 billion trillion miles. Now, the reason we are seeing it now, or just a few years ago, it's 14 billion light years away. Therefore, it has taken 14 billion years for this light to reach us. Well, what was happening 14 billion years ago? It was creation, according to science. So what you're looking at is God is allowing us to see, okay, dum-dums, here's the way I did it. I'm letting you see creation. God has given us the knowledge to develop the means, i.e. the Hubble telescope, where we can actually witness creation. That picture, again, was the universe in its earliest, very earliest stages, 14 billion years ago. Maybe God did this because he felt it was necessary in order to convince us of his power and his way of creation. In my opinion, God's way of creation is not, or was not, a rabbit out of a hat. God has created and is still creating the universe by means that we, as of yet, don't have the brains to figure out. We try awfully hard. But again, it's far more than just an instantaneous rabbit out of a hat, as I said. Okay, a little diversion because I'm going to use this later on. Do you feel as though you're on a treadmill? Well, you are. The Earth is rotating at 1,000 miles an hour. It's orbiting the sun at 20 miles a second. Our solar system is orbiting the center of the Milky Way at 200 miles a second. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is moving towards the nearest galaxy, Andromeda, at 400 miles a second. Now you talk about a train wreck. In a few billion years, you're going to have our galaxy, the Milky Way, colliding with the Milky Way Andromeda. Again, the entire universe is expanding at over 186,000 miles a second, the speed of light. Now what that means is we currently see, with all of our instruments, the most of the universe we will ever be able to see, because the rest of the universe is receding from us at the speed of light, which means the light from distant parts of the universe will never reach the Earth because space is expanding faster than the light is traveling. Well, a classical argument among a lot of scientists is is the way the universe is by chance or by design? Now, I'm not here to try to sell either one. I'm here to try to objectively look at what's the likelihood that these things could have happened by random chance versus somebody, the big guy upstairs, creating it. Let's look at some of the main parameters of the universe, in which we are, the 6 natural laws and the 4 forces, and say, what are they? What would happen if they were not what they are? How fine-tuned are these numbers? And did the universe know we were coming? Here's a quote I like. Penrose is an astrophysicist. He says, the odds of our observed universe appearing by chance are 1 in 10,000 billion, billion, billion. He said one would have a better chance of shaking a fully cooked 3-egg omelet and having it reassemble itself into the 3 original eggs. Okay, so basically, not very likely. Another parameter is the balance of Big Bang, the force of the initial primordial explosion and the force of gravity. Had the force of the explosion been much greater than gravity, the universe would have expanded so rapidly that you would never have matter formed. If it had been far less than the force of gravity would have caused what I stupidly there call nab-gib, which is my version of the opposite of Big Bang. You would have the big crunch, or the universe would have collapsed on itself. The probability or the likelihood of this happening, of this particular balance between the force of the explosion and the normal force of gravity, is equivalent to you throwing a dart clear across the universe and hitting a 1-inch square target. Again, not very likely. Was there an ordered universe at creation? Back from statistics days, statistics says that if an event has even the slightest probability of occurring, given infinite time, it will occur. Statistically, for an ordered universe to occur as a result of random chance, the universe would have to be of infinite age. Cosmologists tell us it's roughly between 14 and 16 billion years, nothing like infinite. Let's look at the laws of DNA and RNA. The probability of DNA evolving by pure chance are kind of like the following. DNA contains 20 different amino acids, 20 different ones. Each collection of DNA has 2 protein chains, each of which have 100 amino acids in them. You would have 1 chance in 10 to the 130th power. Now what that means is 1 chance out of 10 with 130 zeros behind it, 1 out of all of those, of just a simple DNA chain evolving, not intelligent life, just a simple DNA. This is 112 times the total number of seconds since Big Bang. If all volumes of all libraries in all languages were translated to the DNA coding scheme, all of this would occupy 1/10 of the space on the head of a pen. Quite a feat. Here's the double helix DNA. Here's a quote from a guy named Francis Collins. Some of you may know him, some of you may not. Collins was the scientist that was in charge worldwide of sequencing the DNA once it was discovered. He led the team for several years. Here's a quote from his book called The Language of God. It's an interesting book. I'd suggest you read it. He said, DNA is the language by which God spoke life into being. This book is a tremendous book. It's kind of a short book, paperback, but again, it's really 2 books in one. It really describes in pretty good detail the trials and tribulations of sequencing the DNA. But superimposed on that he describes his journey, personal journey, from atheism to faith. So I think it's, to me, a pretty impressive quote. Another law in the universe that we look at are laminins when we're talking about DNA proteins. Laminins are the major proteins that form the foundation for most cells and organs. I refer to it as the wife of proteins because it's kind of the foundation of all families, if you will. They literally hold the other cells together. Laminins do. They hold the family together. But just like a wife, they give the other cells, I'm being kind, instructions of their respective duties in the human body. Laminins are vital for the maintenance and survival of tissues, or the bodies, if you will. Colossians 1:17 expresses Christ as the superglue of the universe. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Here's a schematic of a laminin cell. Here are electron microscope pictures of actual laminin cells. Obviously, the interesting thing here, if you will, for lack of a better word, is that it's the only cell that is shaped like a cross. Does science require God? One of the fundamental tenets of quantum physics is that for reality to exist, it requires an observer outside of the system being observed. Basically, you've probably heard the discussion of Schrodinger's cat. If you have a cat in a box sealed and it has poison in it, what happens if you trip the poison by some remote means? Is the cat dead or alive? Well, quantum physics says yes, he's both. He's in both states. But you will not know true reality until an observation by an outside entity is performed. So quantum physics requires, for anything to be real, that there is an observer outside of the system. Again, the question I ask, if it requires an outside observer for the universe, who is that? But in my opinion, God. If you want to read a convoluted PhD dissertation by a statistician, well, he's not a statistician, he's a theoretical quantum gravity physicist. He's at the University of Manchester in England. His dissertation thesis is an unbelievable Bayesian statistical analysis of the probability that God exists. Well, what is Bayesian statistics? Just a quickie. Let's suppose there are 20 people in a group, and there's somebody in that group has shot somebody not in the group. And you were asked, what's the probability that Joe, one of the members of the group, I think I said maybe, suppose there are 20 people, make up a number, but 20 people. And you're asked, what's the probability that one particular person in that group shot the individual? Well, basic statistics would say there's 1 in 20 chance. There are 20 people, one of them had to do it. Bayesian statistics says, given perfect information, revise that probability. So suppose I told you that of the 20 people, 9 were girls, 11 were boys. Now what's the probability that a boy, Joe, shot the person? It's not 1 out of 20, it's 1 out of 11. That's what Bayesian statistics is all about. His conclusion was interesting. He concluded that there was a 95% probability that God is real. Okay, 67% by what he called reason probability, 28% faith. Now, translated into what we're talking about, that says 67% determined by science and 28% determined by faith. I'm not putting this up as truth or anything. I'm just saying here's an example of where real, sophisticated scientists are trying to study the concept of God. Here's another quote by Freeman Dyson, who's a physicist at Princeton. The more I examine the universe and the details of its architect, the more evident I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we humans were coming. The DNA of the universe, this is George Smoot, and this is one particular character. He's one that referred to one of his cohort scientists as a spherical you-know-what. And when somebody asked him what did he mean by spherical, he said, well, it means any way you look at him. That's what he is. Okay. He said more and more the universe appears to be as it is because it had to be that way. Its evolution was written in its beginnings, if you will, in the cosmic DNA of the universe. The cosmic DNA, as I've said earlier already, is comprised of the 6 natural laws and the 4 natural forces. The 6 natural laws are those 6 parameters that I referred you to, that just 6 numbers. And again, if you really want to be tortured by trying to go through the physics and the math, go to that book. But of those 6, 2 relate to the 4 basic forces. Again, those forces, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, which is holding the nucleus together, the weak nuclear force, which is radiation, and gravity. 2 of them relate to the 4 basic forces. 2 fix the size and texture of the universe. 2 fix the properties of space. These 6 numbers constitute the DNA of the universe. If any one of them varied the slightest, there'd be no stars and no life. Now let's look at some of them. One of them is the critical mass of the universe. Again, if you want to torture yourself, go to the book and look at the math that calculates it. But if it had been off in 1 part in 10 to the 60, that means 1 part with 10 and 60 zeros after it, the universe could not have evolved capable of supporting life. This is equivalent to if you were told to do a paint job on the largest aircraft carrier. 1 speck of paint, more or less, would have rendered the carrier incapable of carrying passengers. That's what this probability means, or this likelihood. What's the probability that the initial conditions of our universe occurred randomly? Well, according to Quantum Enigma, the book, and the page is listed there, it's 1 chance out of 10 with 123 zeros after it, that the initial conditions of our universe would have occurred by chance. This is less than randomly picking 1 specific atom in the whole universe. Now remember, we said there are hundreds of billions of atoms in 1 drop of water. Suppose you had the capacity to uniquely identify by a number or whatever every single atom in the universe, and then you were told to pick atom number 2,933,623. And with 1 pick, you picked that correct atom. That's the probability that the initial conditions of the universe occurred purely randomly. What are critical parameters for life as we know it? The probability of our universe randomly evolving with the critical parameters to support life is 1 in 10 with 220 zeros after it, which is not very much, okay? And this comes from the book, 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity. All of these books are listed at the end of the presentation if you want to look up the numbers. I just was not going through the torturous math with it. Gravity versus electromagnetism. Remember we said 4 forces: electromagnetic force, strong nuclear, weak nuclear, and gravity. Let me ask you this. Which do you think is stronger, the little magnet you put on your refrigerator or gravity? Electromagnetism holds the magnet on the refrigerator. Gravity holds all the planets and the stars in place. Well, the answer is electromagnetism is stronger. Electromagnetism is much stronger than gravity, but only at extremely small distances. It's only when you get that magnet right at the refrigerator that you can feel the force. Gravity is 10 to the 39 times weaker than electromagnetic force. The problem is it pervades the entire universe, so it's very far-reaching. If gravity had been 10 to the 23 times weaker than electromagnetism, the stars would be 1 billion times less massive, which means they would burn out almost instantly. The nuclear weak force, remember we say nuclear weak force is the radioactive force. The nuclear weak force is 10 to the 28th times the strength of gravity. Had the weak force been slightly weaker, all the hydrogen in the universe would have been turned into helium, making life impossible and water impossible. Remember the strong nuclear force, which is the force that holds electrons and protons together in the nucleus. A stronger nuclear force, by as little as 2%, would have prevented the formation of protons, yielding a universe without atoms. Decreasing it by 5% would have given us a universe without stars. Proton versus neutron mass. I'm sure all of you know protons and neutrons are the subatomic particles in the nucleus of an atom. Electrons go around it in terms of your high school chemistry model, which is not right, but that's what we learned. If the difference in the mass between a proton and a neutron were not exactly what it is, that is, roughly a neutron is about twice the mass of an electron, smaller or less than the mass of a proton. But that little difference means the difference whether we have chemistry or not. That's why we've said over and over, physicists love to say this, physics determines chemistry, chemistry determines biology, and biology determines life. So it's in that order. Dean Hamer, who's a geneticist, have problems with those big words like mayonnaise and warehouse. Dean Hamer has isolated a gene that appears to influence our spirituality. His conclusion is that humans inherit a predisposition to embrace a higher power. This is not the God gene that we're going to talk about a little later. Quite different. What we've seen, and we're still going to see some more, is mankind, which was formed from the primeval energy of Big Bang, can discover the details from physics as well as from biblical revelation, i.e. the parameters we've been talking about. So, to where from here? The parallel between the opinion of present-day cosmological theory and the biblical tradition that predates it over 1,000 years is striking, almost unnerving. The question we face is, from what source came the aid in perception of these? The flow of ideas generated by recent advances in scientific cosmology has regenerated a given new slant to the debate about God and the existence of the universe. And I think this is one of the major, my opinion, one of the major contributions quantum physics has made to society. It has made very real now an intellectual discussion between religion and science. Something before that scientists scoffed at and religious people scoffed at, each for different reasons. It was the other guy didn't know what he was talking about. You know? However, a lot of things you'll see in particularly theoretical science places is the discussion, has science replaced religion? Well, science is still as elusive and inaccessible to the general public as any exclusive religion. Science has invaded our lives, our language, and our religions, but not at the intellectual level. The vast majority of people do not understand basic scientific principles. Recent poll by U.S. News and World Report said less than 2% of U.S. citizens are even knowledge of the basic scientific principles. Not that they're scientists, but they don't even understand the basic principles. Here's an example. In a recent survey of college graduates, these were not third graders, these were all college graduates, 80% of the respondents said they would vote to ban the chemical compound known as dihydrogen monoxide. How would you vote? Now, before you say, let's dissect the word dihydrogen and the word monoxide. Di is the prefix meaning two. Hydrogen, of course, two hydrogen. Mono meaning one, oxide meaning oxygen. So the chemical compound is two hydrogen, one oxygen, which is H2O, water. But 8 out of 10 college graduates said, and most of them because of the word monoxide, said they would vote to ban it. Smart bunch of college graduates we have, isn't it? Moses Maimonides, which I've referenced at the first part of the first session, is one of the commentators on the original Hebrew. Remember, he wrote all of his stuff over 1,000 years ago. The title of his book is The Guide for the Perplexed. Here's one of the things he wrote. Each person must form a conception of the existence of the Creator according to our capacities, or our own personal capacities. We must have a knowledge of metaphysics, the science of God, that must be preceded with a knowledge of science or physics. The Almighty commenced the Bible with the description of creation, that is, with physical science. Okay? Design does not mean perfect design. The design of our universe was not perfect from the start. God tells us this in Genesis. By chapter 3, Adam and Eve have sinned. At chapter 4, Cain had murdered Abel, and Abel was a good guy. By chapter 6, God repented that he had even made man. Also, by chapter 6, God caused the flood to wipe out all of Cain's descendants and all but Noah's immediate family. God then hit the reset button on all civilization. Started over, basically. The knowledge of what we consider the divine is contained in two major sources. I'm just repeating what we said initially. The part that's revealed directly by the biblical writings, if you will, but the part that is hidden in the wisdom of nature, and that we have to seek. Let me just make an editorial comment here. I think God gave almost everyone the gift of sight. But the gift of seeing, I think God expects us to work hard to develop. I don't think that's a freebie from God. And that's why I think it's up to us to spend the time to study both. If the existence, this is back to St. Augustine, if the existence of God is true, and if the laws of physics, the DNA of the universe, are also true, then they cannot contradict each other. It's our responsibility to expend the efforts to understand both. How many of us do? Not many of us, including myself. The hidden face of God. Wisdom is the fundamental building block of the universe. Remember the original interpretation of the Hebrew with first wisdom. God created the heavens and the earth. There's a big difference, and I'm not going to go through reading the rest you can, but to me there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. I love the ancient Zen saying that says, knowledge boasts because it knows so much. Wisdom quivers because it knows so little. And I think, each of us, at least I in my pursuit of this, I'm kind of looking forward to, hopefully one of these days, I'll start quivering. But I hadn't reached there yet. It's a long way, okay? This is written by Jastrow, again, who's an astronomer. He says, at this moment it seems as though science will never be able to raise the curtain of the mystery of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith and the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. What does a typical astrophysicist look like? Well, let's kind of look. Dr. Randal is currently ranked as one of the top 3 astrophysicists in the world. Professor of theoretical physics at Harvard. Dr. Randal was one of the 2 persons that predicted the existence of the Higgs boson, which was just discovered. It was announced July 4th, 2012. It was discovered by the the Large Hadron Collider in spans Switzerland-France border. The only other 2 people, well, the only other person other than Randall, was a scientist, which we'll talk about here later if I get to the theme, that basically referred to the Higgs boson as the God expletive deleted particle. The title of his book is The God Particle. His joke is that the reason he could only use one half of the word he referred to the Higgs boson was because his publisher would not let him use the second part of that word. So it turned out to be the God particle, he called it, the boson. The boson is the subatomic particle that gives mass to material. Here's Dr. Randal. Want to take a physics course? I told Grace, my wife, for those of you who are not here, if I could have had her for a physics course, I would make sure that I flunked it at least 10 times, because I'd have to repeat it at least 10 times. She's aged a little now, but this is the way she looked when she made the presentation in 2012 at the LHC on the announcement. She didn't make the announcement, but the announcement of the Large Hadron Collider. There are 3 unanswered questions still in science. Why the laws of nature are what they are, those 6 laws. Why the 4 forces are what they are. And the third one is how life appeared from inanimate objects. Scientists don't have a clue to the answer to any of those. To science, God is a question without an answer. To religion, God is the answer without a question. Although currently on 2 separate tracks, they're beginning to converge, again, particularly through quantum physics. To a scientist, the mind is the church of God. To religion, the church is the mind of God. My personal feeling is that, having known a few pretty bright scientists, not a whole lot, but a few of them, not that the rest weren't smart, I just didn't know. I believe that many a scientist comes as close to God in the laboratory as many people do at the altar in a church. Because when you are dealing particularly with the questions of quantum physics and the origin of the universe, in my opinion, you can't help but think there's something else out there. You know. Well, what's your model of life? This is just a personal comment. While making this personal journey into science and religion, I looked at my personal model of life and decided it was the Wile E. Coyote model. Now, for those young people, you probably don't have the foggiest idea what I'm talking about, but if you've ever seen Roadrunner cartoons, you know, Wile E. Coyote or Willie Coyote, whichever one it is, he always ends up, the ground has disappeared below him. So he had 2 choices, either to find new ground to stand on or to learn to fly. Well, when I got into the question of trying to reconcile religious beliefs that I grew up with hard science that I was spending my academic world in, I had a real hard time with that. So I had to search for new ground to stand on. And that's what this presentation and this search was all about. I knew that I had that problem St. Augustine talked about, is I couldn't reconcile the two. I didn't have the brains or didn't have the knowledge or whatever, but that's where I started. We began by suggesting that science, as well as religion, offers a path in the search for God, and I truly believe that. It's my conviction that only by understanding the world in all its many aspects, reductionist science, holistic, redemptive religion, math, poetry, through good and evil, it's only through understanding all of those that we'll come to understand ourselves and the meaning behind this universe, our home. Thank you very much for listening. The rest of that is just listing references. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to entertain them. By the way, if any of you sick people, not sick really, I'm being sarcastic, want a copy of these crazy slides, Amanda has a copy and she's free to give them to you if you want them. And I think, Bob, do you have a copy of them? I believe you. If not, I can give you a copy and Amanda has them. I would just ask, as I said up front, these are not to be disseminated willy-nilly all over the place, because I didn't do a very good job on each slide mentioning and giving credit to people where some of this information came from. I tried to put them all at the end, but it's not intellectually rigorous presentation that you look at a slide and say, here's where Dumbbell got this from. You know, it's a lot of them, I can't tell you where I got it from, any specific reference, because it's been 50 years that I've been at this. And probably for the last 30 years, about all I've read has been quantum physics. So I had to learn quantum physics first. Okay, I thank you for your presence and for your patience with me. If there are no questions, thanks again and good night.